The evening Elena Marie Whitmore disappeared did not begin with tension or raised voices. It began the way most evenings did in the Whitmore house, quiet, steady, and ordinary in a way that felt dependable. The sun was lowering behind the maple trees lining Maple Ridge Road in their small Ohio town, casting long amber shadows across the front lawn. Inside the modest two-story home, Miriam Claire Whitmore stood at the stove, stirring a pot of tomato soup while listening to the soft hum of the local news from the living room. The house carried the scent of basil and warm bread. It was the kind of smell that settled into the walls over years, the kind that meant someone was always cooking for someone else. Harold Thomas Whitmore sat at the dining table with his reading glasses perched low on his nose, carefully examining the delicate gears of a vintage wristwatch he had brought home from his repair shop. He worked slowly, patiently, the way he did everything. Precision mattered to him. So did routine. Upstairs, Elena was getting ready to step out for a short walk. At 22, she still lived at home while finishing her degree in elementary education at the community college. She had a quiet presence about her, soft brown hair that fell just past her shoulders, thoughtful gray-blue eyes, and a smile that appeared gently rather than suddenly. She was not dramatic or loud. She listened more than she spoke. When she laughed, it was usually because someone else had said something clever. She came down the stairs barefoot at first, then paused at the bottom to slip on her sneakers. Miriam glanced over from the kitchen. "You heading out?" her mother asked. "Just for a bit," Elena replied. "I need some air." There was nothing unusual in her tone. If anything, she sounded lighter than she had earlier that week. Finals were approaching, and she had been spending long hours studying in her room. Harold looked up from the watch and gave her a small nod. "Be back before dark," he said, not sternly, just habitually. "I will," she answered with a faint smile. Miriam dried her hands and walked over, brushing an invisible wrinkle from Elena's sleeve. "It's supposed to get chilly," she added. "Take your jacket." Elena reached for the denim jacket hanging by the door. "I won't be long," she said again, almost reassuringly. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed the pause before she opened the door. Not a dramatic hesitation, just a stillness, as though she were listening to something inside herself. But it passed quickly. She stepped out onto the porch, the screen door closing behind her with its familiar, gentle snap. Harold returned to his watch. Miriam went back to the stove. The news anchor shifted to a weather forecast. Nothing in the house suggested that anything had changed. Outside, the air held the soft warmth of early spring. The sky was brushed with pink and gold. Elena walked down the short path to the sidewalk and turned left, the direction she usually chose. She had walked these streets since she was a child, past the Petersons' white fence, past the old oak tree near the corner, past the small park where she once learned to ride a bike. Neighbors who saw her that evening would later say she looked normal. Calm. Thoughtful, perhaps, but not distressed. One woman across the street remembered Elena giving a polite wave. Back inside, dinner was served at 6:30. Miriam called up the stairs out of habit before remembering Elena wasn't in her room. "She'll be back in a minute," Harold said, pouring himself a glass of iced tea. They waited a few minutes before sitting down. The soup grew cooler than usual. Miriam kept glancing at the clock mounted above the refrigerator. The second hand moved in steady, unhurried circles. By 7:30, the sky had darkened. Harold stood and walked to the front door, stepping onto the porch. The streetlights flickered on one by one. The neighborhood was quiet in the way small towns are quiet, no sirens, no traffic, only the distant hum of someone mowing a lawn a few blocks away. He looked down the sidewalk in both directions. Nothing. He went back inside without speaking. At 8 o'clock, Miriam called Elena's cell phone. It rang once from the kitchen counter. They both turned toward the sound. The phone lay there beside a folded dish towel, untouched. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The house felt different now, not loud or chaotic, but hollow in a way that was hard to name. She must have forgotten it, Miriam said, though her voice had lost its earlier steadiness. Harold nodded slowly. She probably went to clear her head. They told themselves that. They believed it, because there was no reason not to. The porch light remained on long after the dishes were washed. Miriam wiped down the counter twice. Harold checked the street again. The clock continued its quiet circling. At 9, then 10, the evening no longer felt ordinary. But nothing had broken. No windows were shattered. No doors forced open. The watch Harold had been repairing still lay in pieces on the dining table, waiting to be reassembled. The only thing missing was Elena. And in that first hour, it still felt temporary, like a breath held just a little too long, certain to be released. By 10:30, the house no longer felt patient. It felt watchful. Harold stood at the living room window with the curtain pulled slightly aside, scanning the stretch of sidewalk beneath the street lamp. The moths had begun circling the light, tapping softly against the glass globe. Every few minutes, he convinced himself he saw movement at the corner, just shadows shifting, branches bending in the night breeze. "She's probably talking to someone," he said, though he wasn't looking at Miriam when he spoke. Miriam sat at the kitchen table, Elena's cell phone resting in front of her like an unanswered question. She had called 3 of Elena's friends already. No one had seen her. No one had made plans with her. "That's not like her," Miriam replied quietly. "She always tells me." Harold nodded, but his jaw tightened. Elena had always been careful. Not fearful, just considerate. If she stopped somewhere, she called. If she was running late, she explained why. It wasn't obedience. It was habit. Respect. At 11 o'clock, Harold stepped outside again, this time walking all the way to the corner. The night air had turned colder. The houses along Maple Ridge Road were dark now, most families already asleep. His footsteps sounded too loud against the pavement. "Elena," he called once, feeling foolish as soon as the name left his mouth. No answer. Just the low hum of distant traffic from the highway miles away. He checked the small park she liked, the bench beneath the oak tree, the path looping around the swing set. Empty. When he returned home, Miriam was standing in the foyer, arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I think we need to call someone," she said. There was a brief pause between them, not disagreement, but acknowledgement. Saying it out loud made it real. Harold reached for the phone mounted on the kitchen wall. His fingers hesitated over the numbers before dialing. The police dispatcher's voice was calm, almost soothing. "Millfield Police Department. What's the emergency?" "My daughter hasn't come home," Harold said. His voice sounded unfamiliar to his own ears, thin, restrained. "She went for a walk around 6. She left her phone here. She hasn't come back." There were routine questions. Age. Description. Clothing. Any recent arguments? Any reason she might leave intentionally? "No," Miriam answered firmly from beside him. "No, she wouldn't." 2 officers arrived just after midnight. Their cruiser's headlights swept briefly across the front of the house, illuminating the white siding and the flower pots by the steps. Officer Daniel Ruiz and his partner, Officer Karen Malloy, removed their hats as they stepped inside. They were polite. Professional. Measured. "Let's start from the beginning," Ruiz said gently. Harold walked them through the evening again. The soup. The walk. The phone left on the counter. Miriam added small details, what Elena was wearing, the way she'd smiled, the jacket she'd taken. "Any history of running away?" Malloy asked carefully. "No," Miriam answered, the word firm and immediate. "She's not a child." They searched the house. Elena's room was untouched. Her textbooks were stacked neatly on her desk. A half-finished cup of tea sat beside an open notebook filled with tidy handwriting. Her bed was made. Ruiz stepped into the kitchen again and picked up the cell phone. "You're sure she didn't take this?" "It's hers," Harold said. "She never goes anywhere without it." The officers exchanged a brief glance, not suspicious, just thoughtful. "We'll file a missing person report," Ruiz said. Given her age, we can't assume anything yet. Sometimes young adults just take time. Harold's expression hardened slightly. She wouldn't disappear without telling us. Ruiz nodded. I understand. After they left, the house felt too quiet. The ticking of the wall clock grew louder. Miriam sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the front door as if it might open if she focused hard enough. Harold poured 2 cups of coffee no one drank. At 1:30 in the morning, the porch light still burned. Harold refused to turn it off. She needs to see the house, he said. If she's walking back. Miriam didn't argue. By 3 a.m., exhaustion pressed against them, but neither went to bed. Harold checked the street every half hour. Miriam folded and refolded a kitchen towel in her lap. At dawn, pale gray light filtered through the curtains. Birds began their morning calls. It was the cruelest part, the world continuing as though nothing had shifted. At 7, Officer Ruiz called. They had canvassed the immediate area. No reports of disturbances. No accidents. No one matching Elena's description had been admitted to local hospitals. We'll expand the search radius, he said. Have you checked with extended family? She didn't say she was going anywhere, Miriam repeated, though her voice now carried strain. By mid-morning, neighbors had begun to notice the patrol car parked briefly outside. Word traveled quickly in a town that small. Mrs. Peterson from across the street came over with a casserole no one touched. I saw her walking, she offered softly. Around 6. She waved. Which direction? Harold asked. Toward the park. Search volunteers gathered by noon. Flyers were printed at the local print shop, Elena's college photo enlarged and centered beneath bold black letters, missing. Harold studied the picture before taping it to a telephone pole. She looked so alive in it. So present. The hours stretched unnaturally long. Every passing car made Miriam's heart lurch. Every knock at the door sent Harold forward too quickly. But no one brought news. By evening, fatigue gave way to something heavier, not panic, not yet, but a creeping disbelief. The kind that settles into the chest and refuses to be named. At sunset, Miriam stood in Elena's doorway, staring at the empty bed. She'll walk in, she whispered. She has to. Harold stood behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. He didn't speak. He was listening, to the house, to the street, to the faint hope that footsteps might sound against the porch boards. The porch light came on again that night. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the absence of Elena. And it settled into the Whitmore home as though it intended to stay. By the 3rd morning, the word missing no longer sounded temporary. It was printed in bold black ink across hundreds of white flyers, taped to lampposts, grocery store windows, church bulletin boards, and the glass door of Harold's watch repair shop. Elena's college photograph, soft smile, steady eyes, looked out at the town as if asking the same question everyone else was asking. Where did she go? The Millfield Police Department expanded the search radius beyond Maple Ridge Road. Patrol cars drove slowly through neighboring streets. Officers knocked on doors. Volunteers gathered in the church parking lot with bottled water and folded maps. The small town, usually quiet and predictable, moved with a kind of determined urgency. Harold stood near the back of the group, hands in his jacket pockets, listening as Officer Ruiz outlined the plan. We'll break into sections, Ruiz said, pointing to a map taped to the hood of a cruiser. Parks, wooded areas, the creek path, and the stretch along Route 18. If you find anything at all, call it in immediately. Don't touch it. The word anything hung in the air longer than it should have. Miriam held a stack of flyers against her chest. She moved from volunteer to volunteer, pressing the papers into their hands as though they were fragile. Thank you, she said to each one, her voice thin but steady. Neighbors who had known Elena since she was a child joined the search without hesitation. Mr. Callahan from the hardware store combed the trail behind the old grain mill. 2 teenage girls from the high school walked the perimeter of the soccer fields. Even people who had never spoken more than a passing hello showed up. By noon, the sun was high and unforgiving. The early spring chill had faded, replaced by a brightness that felt almost disrespectful. Birds sang in the trees. Traffic moved along the highway. The world refused to slow down. Harold walked the wooded path behind the park, his eyes scanning the ground with mechanical precision. He was not looking for anything specific. A shoe. A piece of fabric. A sign. His mind, trained by years of repairing tiny, delicate parts, searched for disruption, something out of place. Elena, someone called from farther down the trail. Harold froze, heart pounding. But it was just another volunteer testing the quiet. At the police station, detectives reviewed nearby traffic camera footage. Grainy images flickered across a screen, cars passing through intersections, headlights streaking through the dusk. No clear sight of Elena. No sign of her crossing Route 18. No indication she had boarded a bus or entered a store. Officer Malloy called local hospitals again. No unidentified patients. No Jane Does. On the fourth day, search dogs were brought in from a neighboring county. The handlers walked them carefully along the sidewalk outside the Whitmore home. The dogs caught Elena's scent from a sweater Miriam provided and followed it down the familiar route toward the park. The trail ended there. No further. The handler removed his cap and approached Harold quietly. Sometimes scent dissipates, he said. It doesn't necessarily mean. Harold nodded before he finished. He understood unfinished sentences. He lived inside one now. The local newspaper ran a front-page story, college student missing, community rallies. Reporters kept their distance from the Whitmore house, but cameras captured volunteers gathering at dawn. Miriam avoided interviews. Harold answered only what was necessary. We just want her home, he said simply. At night, the search didn't stop, it just grew quieter. Flashlights moved slowly along the creek bank. Radios crackled in low tones. The porch light at the Whitmore home remained on, a small, constant beacon. Inside, exhaustion settled into the bones of the house. Miriam kept a legal pad on the kitchen table, jotting down names of people who called with tips. Most were kind but vague. I thought I saw someone who looked like her at the gas station. I saw a girl walking near the highway. Each lead was checked. Each one dissolved. By the end of the first week, the official language shifted slightly. Active investigation replaced active search. Officers began using phrases like "no signs of foul play at this time." The community's urgency softened into routine concern. But Harold and Miriam did not soften. On the eighth evening, Harold stood at the edge of the park alone. The grass had begun to grow taller, green pushing through the soil as if unaware that anything had happened. He looked at the bench beneath the oak tree where Elena used to sit with her textbooks. She wouldn't just leave, he said aloud, though no one stood beside him. Behind him, Officer Ruiz approached quietly. We're not giving up, Ruiz said. But sometimes, young adults choose distance. Harold turned slowly. She didn't take her phone. She didn't take her wallet. She didn't take anything. Ruiz met his gaze. I know. The honesty in that reply did not comfort him. Back at home, Miriam folded another stack of freshly printed flyers. She smoothed each one carefully, as if the act itself might summon her daughter back through the door. The search continued into the second week, then the third. Fewer volunteers came each morning. Fewer cars circled the neighborhood. The television trucks stopped appearing. But the Whitmores did not stop looking. Because as long as there was no answer, there was still hope. And hope, even when it grows thin and fragile, can be enough to keep a porch light burning long after the rest of the town has gone dark. The search did not end all at once. It thinned. Volunteers returned to their jobs. The church parking lot emptied. The stack of flyers in Miriam's hands grew smaller until there were none left to give away. Police cruisers stopped idling outside the Whitmore home. The official updates became less frequent, then carefully worded, then rare. But inside the house on Maple Ridge Road, nothing moved forward. Spring became summer. The maple trees filled out in thick green. Lawns were cut. Children rode bicycles past the Whitmore driveway as if the world had not shifted slightly off its axis. Harold reopened his watch repair shop 3 weeks after Elena disappeared. He stood behind the counter with the same steady posture, peering through his magnifying loupe, but his hands were not as certain as they had once been. He found himself staring too long at the tiny gears, losing track of where he was in the mechanism. Customers lowered their voices when they entered. "Any news?" they would ask gently. "Not yet," Harold would answer, always the same. "Not yet." Miriam returned to her classroom at the elementary school in late August. She stood before 27 third graders and wrote her name on the board with a steady hand. She smiled when she introduced herself. She tied shoelaces and read aloud from picture books and reminded children to raise their hands. But every afternoon, she drove home expecting to see Elena's car in the driveway. The first year passed in increments of waiting. Birthdays came and went without celebration. Elena turned 23 in absence. Miriam baked a small vanilla cake anyway and set it on the kitchen table. She lit a single candle and let it burn down on its own. Harold did not speak during that quiet ritual. He stood at the sink, staring out the window into the dark backyard. By the second year, the police had no new leads. The file remained open but inactive. Officer Ruiz stopped by occasionally, not with information, but with presence. He would sit at the dining table and review the case as if something might surface through repetition. "There's no sign she crossed state lines," he said once. "No financial activity. No hospital records. It's like she stepped into air," Miriam whispered. Harold had begun checking the mailbox twice a day. He never explained why. He simply opened it, looked inside, and closed it again with a careful click. Seasons continued their quiet rotation. The third year brought changes to the town. The old grain mill was torn down. A new pharmacy opened near Route 18. A young couple moved into the Peterson house across the street. Life rearranged itself, piece by piece. Inside the Whitmore home, Elena's room remained untouched. Miriam vacuumed it once a week. She washed the sheets monthly and remade the bed with hospital corners. The textbooks on the desk gathered no dust because she refused to let them. The denim jacket Elena had worn that evening no longer hung by the door, it had been moved carefully to the back of her closet, as though preserving it in place might preserve something else. Harold could not bring himself to enter the room alone. When he did, it was always briefly. He would stand in the doorway, glance at the framed childhood photograph on the dresser, Elena at age 7, missing her front tooth, holding a sparkler on the 4th of July, and then step away. They did not speak often about worst-case possibilities. They did not need to. The absence lived with them like an invisible third presence at every meal. At Thanksgiving, Miriam set 3 plates at the table the first year. Harold gently removed one before dinner began. The second year, she set only 2, but her eyes lingered on the empty space. By the 5th year, the town no longer used the word "missing" in daily conversation. Elena's story had shifted into something softer, less immediate, a cautionary tale, a quiet mystery folded into local memory. New families moving in did not know her name. But Harold and Miriam did not allow her to fade. Every January, Harold visited the police department to request an update. He asked the same questions. The answers did not change. Detective assignments rotated. New officers skimmed the file, nodding respectfully. "We haven't forgotten," they would say. Time, however, has its own way of altering things. Harold's hair thinned and turned fully gray. Fine lines deepened around Miriam's eyes. They attended fewer social gatherings. Invitations stopped coming as often, not out of cruelty, but discomfort. People did not know what to say after so many years. On the 10th anniversary of Elena's disappearance, the local newspaper ran a small feature, "A Decade Without Answers." A reporter visited the Whitmore home and asked if they still believed she was alive. Miriam did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. Harold looked at her, then at the reporter. Until someone proves otherwise. Hope had changed shape by then. It was no longer bright or urgent. It was quiet, deliberate, and stubborn. It existed not because there was evidence, but because there was none. By year 12, the porch light no longer burned every night, but Harold replaced the bulb regularly, just in case. He kept Elena's phone in a drawer in the kitchen. It had long since lost its charge, but he could not throw it away. Sometimes, late in the evening, Miriam would sit in the living room and imagine the sound of the screen door snapping shut the way it had that spring evening. She could almost hear Elena's footsteps in the hallway, the soft clearing of her throat before speaking. "I'm home." But the house remained still. Friends suggested counseling. Some suggested acceptance. A few, carefully, suggested closure. Harold disliked that word. Closure implied an ending. And they had never been given one. The 15th year arrived quietly. Miriam retired from teaching. Her last class surprised her with a scrapbook of thank you notes. As she stood in the classroom one final time, she felt the weight of years she had continued living while her daughter's life remained paused at 22. At home, the rhythms grew slower. Morning coffee together. Afternoon walks that did not pass the park anymore. Evening news watched from the same two chairs. They did not speak about the possibility that Elena might be gone in a permanent sense. They spoke instead about small things, the weather, the price of groceries, a neighbor's new fence. But every conversation carried an undercurrent. What if? There were moments, rarely spoken, when Miriam feared something even harder than loss, that Elena had chosen not to return. That she was somewhere, living another life, and had decided that the one on Maple Ridge Road no longer fit. Harold dismissed that thought immediately whenever it surfaced. "She wouldn't leave without telling us," he would say. And Miriam would nod, because believing otherwise required a different kind of strength. 17 years is a long time in a small town. Long enough for children to grow into adults. Long enough for houses to change owners twice. Long enough for a case file to grow thin from lack of new pages. But in the Whitmore home, the calendar on the kitchen wall marked time differently. It measured not years, but absence. And even as the world moved forward, steadily, indifferently, the Whitmores remained suspended in that spring evening of 2005, waiting for the sound of a door opening that never came. 17 years had passed inside the Whitmore home as though time were something fragile that might shatter if handled too roughly. What Harold and Miriam did not know, what no one in Millfield knew, was that on the evening Elena stepped off Maple Ridge Road and into the soft light of early spring, she was already carrying something far heavier than anyone had seen. Elena had always been quiet, but in the months before she disappeared, her silence had changed. It had deepened. At school, her professors noticed she had grown more withdrawn. She still turned in her assignments on time. Her grades did not collapse. On the surface, nothing dramatic signaled danger. But inside her notebook margins, beneath lesson plans and childhood development theories, her handwriting grew smaller, tighter, as if conserving space. She had experienced something she did not know how to name aloud, a sudden emotional shock that fractured her sense of safety. It was not violent. It was not criminal. It was not something that would have made headlines. But to Elena, it felt like the ground beneath her had shifted without warning. A trusted relationship had ended abruptly. A future she had quietly imagined dissolved in a single conversation she never repeated to her parents. Words had been spoken that cut deeper than anyone realized. Doubt entered her in a way she could not untangle. "You're stronger than you think," Miriam had told her one afternoon when Elena seemed distracted at dinner. Elena had smiled politely. "I'm fine, Mom." She believed she should be fine. That was the part she could not reconcile. Nothing catastrophic had happened. No tragedy that justified collapse. And yet, something inside her felt unstable, as if her identity had loosened at the edges. She began sleeping less. Thoughts looped without resolution. Ordinary decisions, what to wear, when to study, whether to go out with friends, felt overwhelming. She did not tell Harold. She did not tell Miriam. She did not know how to explain that she felt like a stranger to herself. In the weeks before that spring evening, she had taken long walks alone. Not to escape the house, but to quiet the noise inside her head. The park bench beneath the oak tree became a place where she sat without expectation. Sometimes she cried there, silently. Sometimes she stared at nothing at all. She considered asking for help more than once. But every time she imagined sitting at the kitchen table and saying, "Something isn't right," the words dissolved. Her parents had given her stability her whole life. They had worked hard. They had sacrificed. She did not want to become the reason worry deepened in their faces. So she kept her fracture private. On the day she disappeared, the feeling intensified, not panic, not desperation, but a numb detachment that frightened her more than sadness ever had. She remembers standing at the bottom of the staircase, slipping on her sneakers, aware that something in her had already stepped away. "I need some air," she had said. What she meant was, "I don't recognize myself anymore." When she reached the corner that evening, she did not turn toward the park. She kept walking. The decision was not dramatic. It did not arrive with thunder or clarity. It was simply a continuation of a thought that had been building quietly for weeks. What if I leave? She did not mean forever. She did not mean harm. She meant distance, space wide enough to think without the weight of expectation pressing against her. She walked farther than she had before, past familiar streets into parts of town she rarely visited. At some point, she realized she had left her phone at home. The absence startled her, but it also felt strangely freeing. No calls. No explanations. By the time dusk deepened into night, she stood near the small bus stop off Route 18, where interstate coaches occasionally stopped on their way through. She had no ticket. No plan. Just a feeling that if she went somewhere, anywhere, she might find clarity. A bus pulled in, its headlights cutting through the dark. The driver opened the door with a mechanical hiss. "You getting on?" he asked casually. Elena hesitated only briefly. "Yes," she said. She paid cash from the small amount she carried in her wallet. The destination printed on the side of the bus meant little to her. It was simply away. As the bus pulled onto the highway, she watched Millfield shrink behind her. She expected to feel immediate regret. Instead, she felt a hollow calm. For the first few days in the city where the bus eventually stopped, Elena told herself she would call home once she felt steadier. She rented a cheap room using the cash she had. She avoided thinking beyond the next 24 hours. But the mind, when overwhelmed and untreated, does not reset simply because geography changes. Sleep eluded her. Anxiety sharpened into confusion. She missed meals. She began doubting even basic memories. Was she overreacting? Had she imagined the depth of her pain? The internal questioning grew louder until her sense of continuity blurred. She introduced herself as Lena once when checking into a temporary shelter. The shortened name felt easier, less connected to the girl whose room still waited in Ohio. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Shame settled in. How do you call home after disappearing without explanation? How do you say, "I left because I didn't know how to stay"? The longer she remained silent, the heavier the silence became. At some point, her documents were misplaced during a move between shelters. Without identification, she struggled to access consistent help. She drifted between low-paying jobs, community programs, and temporary housing. Each time she considered returning, the distance felt greater. She imagined her parents angry, disappointed, hurt. She did not imagine them still waiting. The human mind, under prolonged stress, can narrow its world to survival. Elena's became smaller. Immediate needs replaced long-term plans. She avoided mirrors. She avoided conversations about family. Years passed not with intention, but with momentum. What no one knew, not her parents, not the police, not the town, was that Elena had not been taken. She had not been hidden. She had not been silenced by violence. She had been undone by a fracture no one saw. And once she stepped beyond the edge of her old life, she did not know how to find her way back. The bus doors folded shut with a mechanical sigh, sealing Elena inside a decision she had not fully understood when she made it. She chose a seat halfway down the aisle, beside the window. The fabric was worn thin, patterned in muted blues and grays that had seen too many miles. The overhead lights hummed softly. A few passengers glanced at her without interest, an older man in a baseball cap, a young mother rocking a toddler, a college-aged boy with headphones pressed firmly over his ears. No one asked questions. As the bus pulled onto Route 18, the familiar outline of Millfield drifted past in fragments. The pharmacy sign. The dim glow of the diner on the corner. The darkened storefront of her father's watch shop. She pressed her forehead lightly against the cool glass and watched the town flatten into darkness. She expected her heart to race. Instead, it beat with a slow, distant rhythm, as if it belonged to someone else. This is temporary, she told herself. I just need time. The highway opened ahead, wide and unbroken. Streetlights flickered past in steady intervals. The driver adjusted the radio to low country music, the sound barely audible beneath the engine's rumble. Elena folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. The decision felt both enormous and strangely quiet. No one had stopped her. No one had chased after the bus. There had been no dramatic turning point, just a step forward, then another. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter back home. She imagined her mother picking it up, noticing the missed calls. She imagined her father stepping onto the porch again, scanning the street. A flicker of guilt cut through her calm. She could still ask the driver to stop. But the bus was already moving too fast. She leaned back into the seat and closed her eyes, hoping sleep would come and reset everything. Instead, her thoughts replayed in uneven loops, snippets of conversations, unfinished sentences, the weight of expectations she could no longer hold. You're stronger than you think. The words echoed with unintended pressure. Strength, to her, had begun to feel like a performance. Smiling when she wanted to retreat. Studying when her mind refused to focus. Assuring everyone she was fine when she felt hollow. A rest stop arrived near midnight. The bus pulled into a brightly lit gas station plaza where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Passengers stepped off to stretch, smoke, or buy coffee from vending machines. Elena remained seated at first. The world outside the window looked unfamiliar already, though she had not traveled far. Finally, she stood and stepped down onto the pavement. The air was colder than she expected. She wrapped her arms around herself and looked up at the sky. It was the same sky as Millfield's, but it felt farther away. Inside the convenience store, she bought a bottle of water and a small packet of crackers. The cashier barely looked at her. She appreciated the anonymity. When she returned to the bus, the driver glanced at her ticket. First time heading out this way? He asked casually. She hesitated. Yeah. Big city ahead, he said with a shrug. Lot of opportunity. Opportunity. The word landed softly but without conviction. Back in her seat, she watched the miles accumulate. The darkness beyond the window became thicker, the highway signs reflecting brief flashes of green as they passed. With each mile, a strange detachment grew inside her. The further she traveled, the less defined her old life felt. It wasn't that she stopped loving her parents. It wasn't that she wanted to erase her childhood. It was that the version of herself who belonged there felt unreachable. Around 2 a.m, exhaustion finally pulled her under. She drifted into shallow sleep, waking each time the bus slowed or turned. In those half-dreams, she saw her mother's face at the kitchen table, her father standing in the doorway of her bedroom. I'll call them tomorrow, she promised herself. Tomorrow came and went. By dawn, the skyline of a larger city emerged against a pale gray horizon. Buildings rose where fields had once stretched. Traffic thickened. The bus eased into a terminal crowded with strangers carrying suitcases and plastic bags. The driver announced the final stop. Elena stood slowly, her legs stiff. The bus aisle felt narrower now. As she stepped down onto the pavement, the city's noise pressed in, engines revving, voices overlapping, announcements echoing from loudspeakers. For a moment, she considered turning around and boarding the return route. But she didn't. She walked toward the station entrance with no plan beyond staying upright. The crowd absorbed her without resistance. No one knew her name. No one recognized the quiet girl from Maple Ridge Road. The anonymity was both relief and loss. Inside the terminal, she sat on a hard plastic bench and stared at the departures board. Cities scrolled in bright red letters, places she had only read about in textbooks. She felt small in their glow. Who are you now? She wondered. The answer did not come. Instead, a simpler thought formed: just keep moving. And so she did. She rose from the bench, stepped into the flow of people, and began walking into a life she had not chosen so much as drifted toward, carrying nothing but a few dollars, a borrowed name waiting to happen, and a silence that would grow heavier with every passing year. The city did not ask Elena who she had been. It did not ask why she arrived without luggage, without a plan, without a call home. It absorbed her the way large cities absorb thousands of drifting lives every day, quietly, without judgment, without ceremony. For the first week, she stayed in a low-cost boarding house 2 blocks from the bus terminal. The room was narrow, with faded wallpaper and a window that faced a brick wall. She told the clerk her name was Lena. The shortened version slipped out before she could stop it. Last name? The clerk asked, pen poised. She hesitated only a second. Hart. It felt neutral. Soft. Unattached. Lena Hart. The name carried no childhood memories, no porch light left burning, no parents waiting at a kitchen table. It was easier to wear. She told herself again that this was temporary. That once she felt steady, she would call home. But the longer she remained silent, the harder the silence became to break. The first job she found was washing dishes in a diner near the interstate. The manager didn't ask for much documentation, just a social security number she recited from memory and an address she borrowed from the boarding house. She worked evening shifts, hands submerged in hot water, steam fogging her glasses. The work was simple. Mechanical. It required no explanation of who she was. At night, when she lay on the thin mattress in her rented room, the quiet grew loud. Her thoughts looped in restless circles. She imagined her mother calling her friends. She imagined her father walking the park trail again. You should call them, her mind whispered. Tomorrow, she would answer herself. Tomorrow kept moving. Within months, the money thinned. The boarding house changed management. Rent increased. She moved into a women's shelter downtown, carrying everything she owned in a single canvas bag. The shelter required forms she struggled to complete. She left certain lines blank: emergency contact, permanent address. Family? A volunteer asked gently. No, Lena replied too quickly. It wasn't true. But it felt easier. The years did not pass in dramatic events. They passed in small displacements. Temporary jobs. Cleaning hotel rooms. Sorting inventory in a warehouse. Serving coffee in a corner cafe where customers rarely looked up from their phones. She worked hard, quietly, reliably. Employers described her as polite. Reserved. Independent. She avoided close friendships. Questions made her pulse quicken. Where are you from? Ohio, she sometimes said, then changed the subject. As time stretched, her memory of the exact texture of Maple Ridge Road softened. She could recall the porch light, the maple trees, the sound of her father's watch tools clicking together, but the images felt like scenes from a distant film. The mind, under prolonged stress and isolation, narrows. Survival replaces reflection. There were winters when she worried more about staying warm than about who she had once been. Summers when she walked long city blocks just to quiet the noise inside her head. Some years were steadier than others. In her 4th year away, she found part-time work at a small community center assisting with after-school activities. For a brief season, she felt something familiar stir, an echo of the education degree she had once been pursuing. She helped children with reading assignments. She tied sneakers and wiped scraped knees. "You're good with them," the program coordinator said one afternoon. Lena smiled faintly. "I used to study teaching." "Used to." The words caught in her throat. She did not elaborate. But stability slipped again. Funding cuts reduced staff. She lost the position and drifted back into hourly labor. Somewhere around year 7, she stopped marking time. Birthdays arrived unnoticed. Holidays passed as regular workdays. She did not celebrate Christmas. She did not bake cakes. She did not light candles. The silence between her and her parents grew so large that imagining the first words felt impossible. What would she say? "I left because I didn't know how to stay. I thought I needed space. I didn't realize how far space could stretch." Shame deepened quietly. Not because she believed her parents would reject her, but because she knew she had wounded them in a way she could not measure. Around year 10, she misplaced her identification during a move between low-income apartments. Replacing documents required records tied to a life she had abandoned. The process felt overwhelming. She delayed it. The delay compounded. Without proper identification, certain jobs were closed to her. Certain services were harder to access. The world narrowed further. Her appearance changed gradually. Fine lines formed near her eyes. Her hair lost some of its shine. She cut it shorter for practicality. She owned fewer things than she once had. There were nights when she dreamed of her childhood bedroom, sunlight through lace curtains, textbooks stacked neatly on the desk. She would wake with a sharp ache in her chest, disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling above her. Once, in her 12th year away, she stood outside a bus station with enough money to buy a ticket east. She stared at the departure board for nearly an hour. Millfield was not listed, but a nearby city was. She imagined stepping off the bus, walking up Maple Ridge Road, standing on the porch where the light had once burned for her. Would they open the door? Of course they would. The certainty of that answer frightened her more than rejection would have. Because walking back meant facing the years she had let pass. It meant admitting that her silence had not protected anyone, it had only deepened the wound. She did not buy the ticket. Instead, she turned away and walked back toward the shelter she was staying in at the time. 17 years is long enough for a young woman to become middle-aged. Long enough for hair to silver at the temples. Long enough for a town to assume the worst, then slowly move on. But for Elena, the passage of time felt less like forward motion and more like treading water in deep, cold space. There were moments of fragile kindness. A coworker who brought her soup when she had the flu. A shelter counselor who encouraged her to attend group therapy sessions. A volunteer who told her, "You deserve stability." Deserve. The word felt foreign. By year 15, the weight of living without roots began to press harder. The community center reopened under new funding, offering transitional programs for women rebuilding their lives. She enrolled reluctantly. Part of the intake process required appearing on a local awareness segment, highlighting success stories, encouraging donations. She almost declined. "I'm not a success story," she told the coordinator. "You're still here," the woman replied. "That counts. Still here." Elena, though she had not spoken that name aloud in years, felt something shift when she heard it. Not clarity. Not resolution. Just the faint recognition that survival alone was not the same as living. In quiet moments, she would sit on the edge of her narrow bed and press her palms together, trying to remember the exact sound of her mother's voice. The way her father cleared his throat before speaking. The smell of tomato soup in early spring. Memory did not vanish completely. It thinned, but it remained. And somewhere deep beneath layers of shame, detachment, and time, a small thread of connection still existed, unbroken, though stretched nearly beyond endurance. 17 years after stepping onto a bus without a plan, Elena was no longer the frightened 22-year-old who believed distance would solve her fracture. She was a woman who had learned that silence can grow heavier than any truth. She did not know that soon, very soon, a camera would pass across her face during a local broadcast, and a man in a small Ohio living room would lean forward in his chair, heart pounding, recognizing the curve of her eyebrow. She did not know that the thread she thought had thinned beyond visibility was about to pull tight again. For 17 years, she had lived as if untethered. But she had never truly been invisible. October arrived quietly in Ohio, the way it always had, cooler air slipping in through cracked windows, maple leaves turning from green to a deep, restless red. On Maple Ridge Road, the Whitmore house stood unchanged in structure, though time had softened its edges. The paint along the porch railing had faded. The wind chimes Miriam once polished now swayed gently, unattended but still intact. Harold Whitmore was 72 that autumn. His hair had thinned to silver at the temples, and his movements carried the careful deliberation of someone who had learned not to rush. He no longer worked full days at the repair shop. Arthritis had stiffened his fingers, making the tiny gears harder to manage. He kept the shop open part-time, more out of habit than necessity. That afternoon, he sat in his living room recliner with a folded blanket over his knees, the local news murmuring in the background. Miriam was in the kitchen, slicing apples for a pie she did not need but liked to make when the weather turned crisp. The house was quiet in the way long-married homes often are, two people moving through separate routines under the same roof. The anchor introduced a human interest segment. Tonight, we spotlight a transitional housing program in Cleveland helping women rebuild their lives. Harold almost muted the television. These segments were common, brief stories about funding, volunteerism, community efforts. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the word rebuild. The camera cut to a wide shot of a modest brick building. Then to the interior, rows of folding chairs, a bulletin board covered in handwritten affirmations, women seated in a circle listening to a coordinator speak about stability and second chances. Harold's eyes drifted lazily across the screen. Then they stopped. It was not immediate recognition. It was something subtler, a hesitation. The camera moved slowly past a woman seated near the back of the room. Her hair was shorter now, streaked faintly with gray. Her face thinner. Lines faintly etched near her mouth. She looked older, of course. 17 years older. But when she turned slightly to respond to someone off camera, the light caught the small scar above her left eyebrow. Harold leaned forward. The world narrowed to the screen. "Miriam," he said, his voice barely carrying. "In a minute," she called from the kitchen. "No," he said, louder now. "Miriam, come here." There was something in his tone she had not heard in years, not panic, not urgency, but sharp certainty. Miriam stepped into the living room, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What is it?" "Look," Harold whispered. The segment continued. The coordinator spoke about employment assistance, therapy sessions, reclaiming identity. The camera returned briefly to the same woman as she nodded, listening intently. Miriam stared at the screen. At first, she shook her head almost reflexively. "It can't be." But then the woman lifted her hand to brush hair from her face. The scar. A childhood memory surfaced instantly, Elena at age 9, tripping while running through the yard, striking her head against the edge of the mailbox. Blood. Stitches. Miriam holding her hand in the emergency room. The scar had faded over the years but never vanished. Miriam moved closer to the television, as though proximity would sharpen the image. "She would be," Miriam began, then stopped. 39, Harold finished quietly. The anchor resumed speaking over footage of the building exterior. The segment ended with contact information for donations and a mention of next week's feature. The screen shifted to a commercial. Neither of them moved. "It's her," Harold said finally. Miriam's hand rose slowly to her mouth. "After all this time." Harold reached for the remote and rewound the segment. His hands trembled, not wildly, but enough that he had to steady them against his knee. They watched again. And again. Each time, The woman's face seemed both familiar and impossibly distant. 17 years, Miriam whispered. Harold stood abruptly. We need to call the station. Within minutes, he was dialing the number displayed at the end of the segment. The receptionist answered cheerfully, unaware that her ordinary shift was about to intersect with something extraordinary. I'm calling about the housing program story you aired, Harold said, trying to keep his voice steady. There was a woman in the background. I believe she may be my daughter. She's been missing since 2005. There was a pause on the other end. I'm going to transfer you to our producer, the receptionist replied carefully. Miriam stood beside Harold, gripping the back of the recliner. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. As he repeated the story, Elena's disappearance, the scar, the age, the producer's tone shifted from polite interest to focused attention. We can't share personal information without consent, the producer said, but we can pass your contact details to the organization and request they reach out. Harold swallowed. Please. After he hung up, the house fell silent again, but not the same silence that had lived there for years. This one vibrated with something fragile and electric. Hope. It was dangerous. It had been before. Miriam sat down slowly. What if it isn't her? Harold looked at her with an expression she recognized from long ago, measured, resolute. Then we'll know, he said. But if it is? He did not finish the sentence. Night fell outside the living room windows. The porch light flicked on automatically, just as it had for 17 years. For the first time in a long while, it did not feel like a symbol of waiting. It felt like a signal. Hundreds of miles away, in a modest transitional housing center in Cleveland, a woman who had once been Elena Whitmore finished her evening session and returned to her small room. She did not know that her face had traveled across television screens into a house that had never stopped belonging to her. She did not know that a thread she believed stretched beyond sight had just been seen, clearly, unmistakably, by the one man who had never stopped looking. October 2022 did not announce itself as a turning point. It arrived as a broadcast. And in a quiet living room in Ohio, two aging parents leaned toward a screen and felt, for the first time in 17 years, that the silence might finally be breaking. The waiting that followed the broadcast felt different from the waiting of the past 17 years. Before, the silence had been empty, wide and unanswered. Now it felt charged, as if something fragile had been set into motion and might break if handled too roughly. The morning after the segment aired, Harold woke before dawn. He had slept little. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the image again, the turn of her head, the scar above her eyebrow catching the light. Miriam found him in the kitchen, already dressed, standing by the window. You didn't sleep, she said gently. Did you? He asked. She shook her head. The phone sat on the table between them, silent. They had written down the name of the housing program in careful block letters. Cleveland. Transitional Housing Initiative. The producer had promised to forward their information. Promise. Another word that could bruise if leaned on too heavily. By mid-morning, Harold could not sit still. He called the television station again, asking politely if the organization had been contacted. The producer assured him they had forwarded the message but reminded him that privacy laws limited what could be shared. We'll let them know you're hoping to hear from someone, she said. Hoping. The word felt thin after 17 years. 2 days passed without a call. On the third afternoon, as Miriam folded laundry in the living room, the phone rang. The sound froze both of them. Harold reached it first, his hand trembling only slightly this time. Hello? A woman's voice answered, calm but careful. Mr. Whitmore? My name is Angela Morris. I'm the director of the Cleveland Transitional Housing Initiative. Harold swallowed. Yes. We received your message through the television station, Angela continued. You believe one of our residents may be your daughter. Harold glanced at Miriam, who had gone still beside him. Yes, he said. Her name is Elena Marie Whitmore. She's been missing since April 2005. There was a pause long enough to hold 17 years inside it. We cannot confirm identities without consent, Angela said, but I can tell you that one of our participants has a similar age and background timeline. She reacted strongly when we asked her if she was originally from Ohio. Miriam's hand flew to her mouth. Is she there? Harold asked, voice breaking for the first time. She is, Angela replied gently. But before any contact happens, we need to verify identity properly. This is for her protection and yours. Harold nodded, though she could not see him. Of course. The next steps were procedural and painfully slow. Angela requested photographs from Elena's childhood and early adulthood. Miriam gathered albums from the hallway closet, her fingers shaking as she flipped through years that had never lost their color. Here, she whispered, handing Harold a photo of Elena at 21, smiling on the front porch. And this, after the mailbox accident. They scanned and emailed images. Angela arranged for their resident to review them privately. 2 more days passed. On the 5th evening, the call came again. She recognized the photos, Angela said quietly. She identified both of you immediately. Miriam sank into the couch, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. She remembers? Harold asked. She remembers enough, Angela replied. But there are gaps. Trauma and prolonged stress can do that. She's been living under the name Lena Hart. Harold closed his eyes. Lena. She's agreed to speak with you, Angela continued, but we'd like to facilitate the first conversation in a controlled setting. It's important this is handled carefully. Whatever you recommend, Miriam said, leaning closer to the phone. The video call was scheduled for the following afternoon. That night, neither of them ate dinner. The house felt suspended again, but this time not in despair, in anticipation so sharp it bordered on fear. What if she looked at them and felt nothing? What if they looked at her and saw someone unrecognizable? At precisely 3 o'clock the next day, Angela appeared on their laptop screen from a modest office in Cleveland. Behind her, neutral walls and a small bookshelf. She adjusted the camera. She's here, Angela said softly. The screen shifted. For a moment, the image blurred as the camera refocused. Then she was there. Elena. Older. Thinner. Her hair cut shorter than Miriam had ever seen it. Fine lines traced the corners of her eyes. But the eyes themselves, gray-blue, steady, were unmistakable. No one spoke at first. Elena's hand rose slowly to her mouth, mirroring her mother's gesture from days earlier. Hi, she said. Her voice was quieter than Harold remembered, but it carried the same cadence. Miriam leaned forward. Elena? The name seemed to settle over the screen like something sacred. Tears gathered in Elena's eyes. I didn't know how to call you, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know what to say. Harold's throat tightened. You don't have to say anything right now. I'm sorry, she whispered. 17 years condensed into that apology. Miriam shook her head through tears. You're alive. It was not accusation. Not even relief alone. It was astonishment. Elena nodded slowly. I am. Angela remained just off camera, giving space but staying present. Harold leaned closer to the screen. We never stopped looking, he said quietly. Elena closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of those words. I thought, after so long, she began, then faltered. After so long what? Miriam asked gently. That you'd stopped waiting. Harold let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, though it broke midway. The porch light, he said. It stayed on longer than the bulb did. Elena's lips trembled. Recognition did not arrive as fireworks or dramatic declarations. It unfolded slowly, through shared memories. The mailbox, Miriam said softly. You ran into it chasing the dog. Elena nodded through tears. I told you it was the dog's fault. You were 9, Harold said. You always blamed the dog. A faint, familiar smile crossed her face. That was when they knew, not just from the scar, not just from the timeline, but from the way her laugh sounded through tears, that the thread had not broken. It had stretched. Recognition is not only seeing someone's face. It is hearing their voice and knowing it belongs to you. It is watching time alter features but not erase essence. It is realizing that 17 years of silence cannot fully extinguish connection. When the call ended, Angela assured them that arrangements could be made for an in-person meeting, pending further counseling and logistical planning. The screen went dark. Harold and Miriam sat in stunned quiet. "She's alive," Miriam whispered again, as if testing the shape of the words. Harold nodded slowly. For 17 years, they had lived without confirmation. Now they had something more powerful than hope. They had recognition. And with it, the fragile beginning of return. The days leading up to the reunion moved with a strange combination of urgency and restraint. After the video call, arrangements were made carefully. Angela Morris and the transitional housing team recommended that the first in-person meeting take place in Cleveland, in a quiet, supported setting. Elena agreed. So did Harold and Miriam. They drove east 3 days later. The highway that had once carried Elena away now carried her parents toward her. Harold gripped the steering wheel with steady hands, though his mind replayed every second of the video call. Miriam sat beside him, clutching a small box in her lap. Inside it were photographs, carefully chosen, not overwhelming, fragments of years Elena had missed. They did not speak much during the drive. Words felt fragile. When they arrived at the housing center, the building looked modest, practical, unremarkable from the outside. A brick exterior. Narrow windows. A small sign near the entrance. Harold turned off the engine but did not immediately open the door. "Are you ready?" Miriam asked quietly. He looked at her, eyes steady but shining. "I've been ready for 17 years. Inside, Angela greeted them with warmth and professionalism. She led them into a private meeting room, soft chairs arranged in a circle, a small table with tissues placed discreetly in the center. "She's just down the hall," Angela said gently. "We'll give you space, but I'll remain nearby." Harold stood when he heard footsteps outside the door. The handle turned slowly. And then she was there. Not on a screen. Not through a pixelated image. Standing 3 steps away, flesh and breath and trembling hands. Elena paused at the threshold, as if crossing it required something more than physical movement. Her hair was shorter than Miriam remembered, streaked lightly with gray. She wore a simple sweater and jeans. There was nothing dramatic about her appearance, no theatrical reveal, just the visible weight of years lived differently. Miriam took a step forward first. "Elena," she said, barely above a whisper. The name seemed to anchor the room. Elena's eyes filled instantly. "Hi, Mom." The word broke something open. Miriam crossed the remaining distance and wrapped her arms around her daughter. The embrace was not rushed. It was not tight with desperation. It was steady, 2 bodies relearning the shape of each other. Elena stiffened for only a second before folding fully into her mother's arms. "I'm so sorry," she murmured against Miriam's shoulder. Miriam shook her head through tears. "You're here." Harold stood a few steps away, watching. For a moment, he did not move. He seemed to be memorizing the scene before entering it, as if afraid it might dissolve. Elena looked up and met his eyes. "Dad." He stepped forward then, and the years seemed to fall away from his face all at once. He did not speak immediately. He simply pulled her into his arms, holding her with a careful strength. Not crushing. Not tentative. Just certain. She felt smaller than he remembered. Lighter. As if the world had worn her down in ways he could not yet understand. "You came back," he said finally, voice thick. She nodded against his chest. "I didn't know how to come back sooner." They pulled apart slowly, but remained close enough that their hands still touched. They sat down together in the circle of chairs. For a moment, no one knew where to begin. Miriam reached for the small box in her lap. I brought these, she said softly. She handed Elena a photograph, her at 22, standing in front of the Whitmore home. Elena stared at it for a long time. I remember this, she said quietly. That was before finals. Yes, Miriam replied. You were exhausted. Elena gave a faint, fragile smile. Harold leaned forward. You don't owe us every explanation today, he said carefully. We just needed to see you. Elena swallowed. I thought you'd be angry. Harold shook his head. We were scared. We were confused. But angry? He paused. No. The simplicity of that answer seemed to steady her more than anything else. I didn't leave because of you, she said, her voice gaining strength. I left because I didn't know who I was anymore. I felt broken. And I didn't want you to see that. Miriam reached for her hand. We would have rather seen you broken than not at all. The words settled gently between them. There were no accusations. No raised voices. Only questions shaped carefully. Did you feel safe? Harold asked. Yes, she said. Mostly. I made mistakes. I struggled. But I wasn't hurt. That mattered. They spoke for nearly 2 hours, though time felt indistinct. Elena explained the early confusion, the shame that grew heavier with each passing year. The fear that returning would only magnify the damage she believed she had caused. I thought after a few months it would be too late, she said. Then after a year, I thought you'd stopped waiting. Then after 5 years. I didn't know how to face you. Harold looked at her steadily. We never stopped. She closed her eyes briefly, absorbing that truth. At one point, Miriam reached up and brushed her thumb lightly over the faint scar near Elena's eyebrow. You still have it, she said. Elena smiled softly. I guess some things don't disappear. No, Miriam replied. They don't. When the conversation began to slow, Angela knocked gently on the door, checking in. Elena assured her she was okay. Harold and Miriam nodded their thanks. Before leaving, Miriam stood once more and pulled her daughter into another embrace, this one less tentative, more familiar. You don't have to decide everything today, she said. We can take this slowly. Elena nodded. I want to come home, she said, the words tentative but sincere. I just need to do it the right way. Harold placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Home isn't a place you lost, he said. It's a place that stayed. As they walked out of the building together, the late afternoon light stretched long across the parking lot. The air carried the crisp edge of October. The reunion was not cinematic. There were no cameras. No crowd. No dramatic music rising beneath tears. There were simply 3 people standing close together after 17 years of separation, learning the rhythm of each other's breathing again. 17 years had not erased love. It had tested it. Stretched it. Weathered it. But as Harold opened the car door and Elena hesitated before stepping toward it, Miriam touched her arm gently. You don't have to be perfect, she said. You just have to be here. Elena looked at the car, then back at the building behind her. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the direction she chose was not away. It was toward. The drive back to Ohio was quieter than the drive to Cleveland, but it was not heavy. Elena sat in the passenger seat this time, Miriam in the back so she could watch her daughter without staring too directly. The highway unspooled ahead in long, steady lines. No one rushed the conversation. The reunion had happened. The truth, however, still waited to be fully spoken. It came later that evening, in the living room on Maple Ridge Road. The house felt smaller to Elena than she remembered. The hallway narrower. The ceiling lower. But the scent, faint tomato and old wood and laundry soap, was the same. When she stepped through the front door, she paused, just briefly, as if crossing into a memory that had been preserved in glass. Her old room remained intact. She had seen it earlier in photographs Miriam sent to Cleveland, but standing in the doorway now was different. The bed was still made with careful corners. Her textbook sat in the same place. The desk lamp she once used for late-night studying had not moved. "You kept it," she whispered. Miriam nodded. "We didn't know what else to do." Elena stepped inside slowly, running her fingers across the desk surface. A thin film of polish, not dust, coated it. Someone had cared for this room. Later, when night settled and the house grew still, the three of them gathered in the living room. No television. No background noise. Just the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the occasional creak of settling wood. It was Elena who began. "You deserve to know," she said quietly. Harold leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. Miriam folded her hands in her lap. "I didn't leave because of something you did," Elena continued. "I left because I didn't know how to exist anymore." The words were simple, but they carried years of unspoken weight. She told them about the breakup she had never fully explained, the relationship she had invested her future in quietly, the sudden ending that made her question everything she believed about herself. It had not been dramatic. There had been no betrayal loud enough to justify collapse. But it had shattered something internal. "He told me I was too sensitive," she said. "Too uncertain. That I didn't know who I was." Harold's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent. "I started believing him," Elena said. "I began second-guessing everything. My major. My plans. Even whether I was strong enough to finish school." She described the insomnia. The way thoughts looped endlessly at night. The numbness that followed. How she would sit at the kitchen table, hearing her parents talk, and feel like she was watching herself from outside. "I felt like I was disappearing before I ever left," she admitted. Miriam's eyes filled, but she did not interrupt. "I wanted to tell you," Elena continued. "So many times. But you both worked so hard. You were proud of me. I didn't want to become a problem you had to fix." Harold shook his head gently. "You were never a problem." Elena's voice trembled. "I know that now. But I didn't then." She explained the walk that evening, the way the thought of distance felt like oxygen. How stepping onto the bus felt less like running away and more like pressing pause on a life she didn't know how to live. "At first, I thought I'd call you in a few days," she said. "But then the shame started." Shame grew in layers. Each day she remained silent made the next day harder. Weeks became months. Months became years. She told them about losing her documents, about drifting between jobs and shelters, about the way identity slowly erodes when it's untethered from history. "I convinced myself you'd be better off not knowing how much I'd fallen apart," she said. Miriam reached for her hand. "We would have rather known," she said gently. "Even the worst of it." Elena nodded, tears sliding down her face. "I thought I was protecting you from disappointment." Harold leaned back slightly, absorbing the words. "You weren't protecting us," he said quietly. "You were protecting yourself from facing us." She met his eyes, and for a moment, there was no defensiveness, only recognition. "Yes," she said. The truth was not explosive. It was not criminal. There was no hidden villain, no dark conspiracy. The shock lay in its simplicity. She had vanished because she did not know how to speak about her pain. She had stayed away because silence felt easier than vulnerability. "I didn't understand mental health the way I do now," she said. "I didn't know that what I was feeling had a name. Depression. Dissociation. I thought it meant I was weak." "You were overwhelmed," Miriam said softly. Elena nodded. She described the moment, years later, when a counselor at the transitional program first used the word trauma, not in the sense of violence, but in the sense of identity fracture. It wasn't about what happened, the counselor had told her. It was about how it changed the way you saw yourself. That realization had unsettled her. She had not been taken. She had not been harmed physically. She had stepped away from her own life and watched it fade behind her. "And the longer I stayed away," Elena said, the more I felt like I didn't deserve to come back. Harold's voice softened. You never stopped belonging here. The room grew quiet again. The truth did not undo the years. It did not erase birthdays missed or holidays spent in silence. But it reframed them. Elena had not been stolen. She had been lost inside herself. And for 17 years, she had carried that loss alone. I'm not asking you to pretend it didn't hurt, she said carefully. I know I hurt you. Miriam squeezed her hand. You did, she said honestly. But you're here now. Honesty did not fracture the moment. It strengthened it. Harold stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened street. The porch light cast its familiar glow across the front steps. We thought the worst, he admitted quietly. There were nights I stood right here and imagined things I can't even say. Elena's breath caught. But none of those things were true, he continued, turning back toward her. The truth is harder in some ways. Because it means you were suffering, and we didn't see it. Miriam shook her head gently. We see it now. The truth, when fully spoken, did not feel like a confession. It felt like a bridge, fragile, but real. 17 years had not been built on violence or deception. They had been built on silence. And silence, once named, loses some of its power. That night, when Elena lay in her old bed for the first time since she was 22, she did not feel entirely at ease. The room held ghosts of who she had been. But it also held something else. Permission. Permission to return imperfect. Permission to admit she had been overwhelmed. Permission to speak before silence grew again. Down the hall, Harold turned off the porch light for the first time, not out of habit, but because someone was already home. The first morning back did not feel triumphant. It felt unfamiliar. Elena woke before sunrise, the way she had trained herself to in shared shelters and temporary housing programs. For a moment, she did not recognize the ceiling above her. The pale blue paint, the faint crack near the corner, the soft hum of the furnace, these belonged to another life. Then memory settled gently into place. She was home. Not the version of home she had left at 22, but the one that had waited. She sat up slowly, her hands resting on the quilt Miriam had folded at the foot of the bed. The room still carried faint traces of her younger self, books she once planned to read, framed photos from high school, a small ceramic figurine she had forgotten she owned. Nothing had been rearranged. Nothing had been erased. It was both comforting and overwhelming. Downstairs, she heard the quiet rhythm of dishes being placed on the table. Harold's footsteps. Miriam's soft cough. Ordinary sounds. She hesitated before opening the bedroom door. Reunion is one thing. Living together again is another. When she stepped into the kitchen, Miriam turned first. For a split second, surprise crossed her face, not because she did not expect Elena to be there, but because part of her still could not believe it. Good morning, Miriam said gently. Morning, Elena replied. The word felt new. Harold looked up from the coffee maker. Sleep okay? Yeah, she said, though the truth was she had woken several times, unsure of her place. They sat at the table together. 3 mugs. 3 plates. The third plate no longer symbolic. Conversation began cautiously. Do you still take your coffee with sugar? Miriam asked. Elena paused. I don't, actually. I stopped a few years ago. Miriam nodded, adjusting without comment. These small discoveries felt significant. Preferences had changed. Habits had shifted. The girl they remembered had grown into someone else. Over the next few days, they learned each other in increments. Harold discovered that Elena now preferred quiet mornings and long evening walks. Miriam learned that Elena folded towels differently, stacked dishes in a new order, listened more than she spoke. Elena, in turn, noticed how much her parents had aged. The slight tremor in Harold's left hand. The way Miriam leaned slightly to one side after standing too long. Time had not paused for them. One afternoon, Elena found herself standing in the garage beside her father while he worked on a watch. "You still do this?" she asked softly. "Part-time," he said. "Slower now." She watched his hands move with careful precision. "I remember thinking you could fix anything," she said. Harold smiled faintly. "I could fix watches." The unspoken truth lingered between them. He had not been able to fix her silence. Elena reached out gently. "It wasn't something you could repair," she said. He glanced at her, surprised by the directness. "I know that now," he replied. Relearning each other meant accepting new boundaries. There were topics they approached slowly. Years she summarized instead of detailing. Questions her parents held back out of respect. Miriam suggested counseling, together. "Not because we're broken," she clarified one evening. "But because we don't want to repeat silence." Elena agreed. The first family therapy session felt awkward. Sitting in a circle with a licensed counselor, speaking aloud about 17 missing years, required courage none of them had practiced. But something shifted in that space. They spoke about fear, not just Elena's fear of disappointing them, but Harold's fear of losing control, Miriam's fear of asking questions that might push too hard. "I didn't want to pry," Miriam admitted during one session. "When you were younger, I thought giving you space meant trust." "I mistook that space for distance," Elena said quietly. The counselor nodded. "Communication isn't instinctive. It's learned." So they began learning. They created small rituals. Sunday dinners became intentional, not assumed. They took walks together around the neighborhood, not as a performance for curious neighbors, but as a quiet reclaiming of shared ground. Some neighbors approached cautiously. "We're glad she's back," Mrs. Peterson said one afternoon. Elena smiled politely. She understood the curiosity behind the kindness. A town that had once searched for her now watched her return with equal fascination. It would take time for the whispers to settle. But inside the Whitmore home, something steadier was forming. One evening, Miriam found Elena sitting alone on the porch steps, staring at the yard. "You okay?" she asked. Elena nodded. "It's strange," she admitted. "I thought coming back would feel like stepping into the past. But it doesn't." "What does it feel like?" Miriam asked gently. "Like starting over," she said. "Not from where I left, but from here." Miriam sat beside her. "We can start from here," she said simply. Relearning each other also meant forgiveness, spoken and unspoken. There were moments when Harold caught himself watching Elena too closely, as if afraid she might vanish again. He forced himself to step back. "I trust you," he told her one evening when she mentioned meeting a friend from the transitional program for coffee. Elena held his gaze. "Thank you." Trust had to be rebuilt quietly, without constant reassurance. There were tears some nights. Regret for birthdays missed. Gratitude for ordinary mornings. A shared acknowledgement that time could not be restored, but connection could be renewed. Elena applied for part-time work at a local elementary school as a classroom aide. When she received the call offering her the position, she sat at the kitchen table with her parents beside her. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "Good," Harold said gently. "That means it matters." The first day she walked into that classroom, she felt a familiar stirring. The version of herself who had once dreamed of teaching had not entirely disappeared. She had been paused, not erased. In the evenings, she returned home and described the children she worked with. Miriam listened with quiet pride. Harold asked practical questions. Relearning each other meant seeing each other not as frozen in memory, but as evolving. One night, weeks after her return, Elena stood in the hallway outside her parents' bedroom. "Can I say something?" she asked. "Of course," Miriam replied. "I don't want to disappear again," Elena said plainly. Harold sat up straighter. "Then don't do it alone," he answered. It was not a command. It was an invitation. The house on Maple Ridge Road no longer felt suspended in 2005. It breathed differently now. Laughter returned in small bursts. Silence no longer carried fear. Relearning each other was not about recreating the past. It was about accepting who they had all become. And in that acceptance, something stronger than memory began to grow, something built not on waiting, but on presence. News travels quickly in a small town, even when no one intends it to. By the second week after Elena's return, Maple Ridge Road no longer felt quite the same. It wasn't loud or intrusive. No reporters camped on the lawn. No television vans lined the curb. But curtains shifted more often. Neighbors slowed their cars as they passed the Whitmore house. Familiar faces lingered a moment longer at the mailbox. At first, Harold disliked the attention. He had guarded his family's privacy for 17 years. Now, the same town that had once searched the woods with flashlights seemed to be searching Elena's face for answers. But Millfield was not cruel. It was curious. Mrs. Peterson crossed the street one crisp afternoon with a covered casserole dish in her hands, just as she had the week Elena vanished. "I don't know what to say," she admitted at the door, her eyes misting. "But I'm glad you're home." Elena accepted the dish with a small, steady smile. "Thank you." That exchange repeated in different forms over the next few days. Handwritten cards appeared in the mailbox. A bouquet of fall flowers was left anonymously on the porch. At church that Sunday, heads turned, not in judgment, but in quiet disbelief. Pastor Reynolds approached Elena gently after the service. "We prayed for you," he said simply. "For years." Elena nodded. "Thank you for not giving up." The town's reaction was not explosive. It was reflective. The local newspaper requested an interview. Harold declined at first, but after discussion with Elena, they agreed to a brief, carefully worded statement. "We're grateful our daughter is safe," Harold told the reporter. "This has been a long journey. We ask for privacy as we continue healing as a family." The headline that ran 2 days later was simple: "After 17 years, Millfield woman returns home." There were no accusations. No speculation. Just astonishment. At the diner on Route 18, conversations shifted. "I always thought she'd come back," one regular said, stirring his coffee. "You lose track of people," another replied. "But you don't lose hope." Parents in town began speaking differently to their children. Teachers mentioned resources for mental health more openly. The high school counselor noticed an increase in students asking questions, not dramatic ones, but honest ones. "What do you do if you feel like you can't talk to your family?" Elena's story, though never fully public in detail, had opened a door. At the elementary school where she now worked part-time, whispers circulated quietly among staff. Some colleagues approached her carefully. "You don't owe anyone explanations," the principal told her gently. "But if you ever want to share your perspective with the faculty, it might help others." Elena thought about it for several days. Eventually, she agreed to speak, not about the specifics of her disappearance, but about silence. In a small staff meeting, she stood at the front of the room, hands clasped loosely. "I didn't leave because I hated where I came from," she said calmly. "I left because I didn't know how to say I was struggling." The room grew very still. "If you notice a student withdrawing," she continued, "don't assume they're just quiet. Sometimes quiet means overwhelmed." Her words were not dramatic. They were measured. But they lingered. Millfield adjusted. Not in gossip. Not in spectacle. But in awareness. There were still questions that would never be fully answered. Some residents speculated privately about why she had stayed away so long. Others wondered whether they would have handled things differently in her place. But over time, those questions softened. Because what remained most visible was this: a family reunited. A porch light that no longer burned in waiting. A woman walking down Maple Ridge Road again, not as a ghost of memory, but as someone present. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the maple trees, Elena walked past the old oak near the park where volunteers had once gathered to search for her. The grass had grown thick over the years. Children now played where search dogs once paused. She stopped for a moment and looked around. The town had not frozen in her absence. It had moved on. And yet, it had made space for her return. That, perhaps, was the quiet miracle. Not that she came back, but that there was still somewhere to come back to. In the weeks after Elena's return, life in Millfield settled back into something recognizable. The maple leaves fell. The air sharpened toward winter. The rhythm of the town resumed its quiet pattern: school buses in the morning, porch lights at dusk, the steady hum of ordinary days. But for the Whitmores, ordinary no longer meant unnoticed. It meant presence. There had been no crime scene. No villain. No courtroom confession. The shock of Elena's story did not lie in violence or betrayal. It lay in something far more common, and far more difficult to confront. Silence. For 17 years, a family had lived suspended between hope and fear because one young woman did not know how to say, "I'm not okay." That truth unsettled people more than any darker explanation might have. Because it meant this could happen anywhere. Not only in broken homes. Not only in chaotic lives. But in loving households where expectations are gentle, where dinner is served on time, where parents believe their children will come to them if something is wrong. The Whitmores had done many things right. They had worked hard. They had loved deeply. They had kept a room ready. And yet, they had missed the quiet fracture forming inside their daughter. Elena did not leave because she was unloved. She left because she felt unworthy of being seen in her pain. That distinction matters. In the months following her return, Harold often found himself reflecting on the difference between providing and perceiving. He had given his daughter stability. He had given her structure. But had he asked enough questions that allowed for vulnerability? Miriam wrestled with similar thoughts. She had believed giving Elena space meant trust. Now she understood that space, without conversation, can sometimes widen into distance. But regret, when left unattended, can harden into guilt. And guilt, like silence, builds walls. The lesson of their story was not about blame. It was about listening. Listening not only to words, but to pauses. To the way someone answers, "I'm fine," too quickly. To the way exhaustion lingers in their eyes. It was about creating homes where weakness is not interpreted as failure. Elena learned something, too. Strength is not the absence of struggle. It is the willingness to speak before silence grows too heavy. For years, she believed leaving protected the people she loved from her brokenness. She now understood that love is not protected by distance, it is strengthened by honesty. 17 years had been lost. Birthdays missed. Holidays passed. Seasons unshared. Time does not return what it has taken. But it does offer something else, the chance to live differently moving forward. In quiet evenings now, when the Whitmores sit together at the kitchen table, there are no grand speeches about forgiveness. No dramatic declarations about miracles. There is conversation. Sometimes about simple things, the price of groceries, a student's progress at school, the neighbor's new fence. And sometimes about heavier truths. "I'm having a hard day," Elena might say. And that sentence no longer feels dangerous. Harold no longer stands at the window imagining worst-case scenarios. Miriam no longer folds silence into polite acceptance. The porch light still turns on at dusk out of habit. But it no longer signals waiting. It signals welcome. If there is a moral to their story, it is not that hope guarantees reunion. Not every missing person returns. Not every silence breaks gently. The moral is this. Ask the harder questions while there is still time. Make space for uncomfortable answers. And never assume that love alone replaces conversation. Because sometimes the most shocking truth is not that someone was taken. It is that they were quietly unraveling in the same house you shared, and no one knew how to reach them. Elena's story did not end in tragedy. It ended in awareness. And awareness, if tended carefully, can be the difference between losing someone to silence, and walking beside them through it.